Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Post-Military Podcast, where we share stories of veterans' transition out of the military and their advice to other service members based on their life experience. Whether you are still in service, a veteran, or just someone preparing to transition into a new chapter of your life, there is something here for you to learn. I've included timestamps in the description of the episode, so head down there to see if there are any topics that are of particular interest to you. Also, while you're poking around, subscribing to the channel or podcast on your favorite platform is always greatly appreciated. Anyway, thank you so much for being here today, and I hope you enjoy the episode.
Do solemnly swear
Do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend
that I will support and defend
the Constitution of the United States
the Constitution of the United States.
Planet Earth, when Morgan Freeman narrated that, but imagine it narrated by Jocko. That would be sick. I don't know. I think I need to see that. So someone could easily do that now with voice swapping tech. But
some of the swapping that they're doing with singers. What was the one I saw? I want to say it was Frank Sinatra doing rap, and it was actually pretty cool.
That's sweet. At this point, there's enough audio of you for someone to make a pretty convincing voice model of Paul Pantani, and then you could just do fake podcasts. Think about that.
That's a good idea.
I'm just saying.
Get a big head start on a bunch of episodes, so I don't have to constantly be playing catch up.
I would love it. Yeah, just ChatGPT, generate me an episode about something cool, and then you could just interview fun people that don't exist, like the Master Chief.
I know they're already doing it to Rogan. They're doing it quite a bit.
Yeah, all those big name people are showing up in advertisements and fake podcasts. And there's honestly, the scariest podcast that I've seen recently was, are you a Lex Friedman fan by any chance? Do you know? Yeah. Did you see?
He actually hasn't had an episode out in a while. Is he in Israel?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm sure he's going to drop some crazy stuff with, like, he's going to interview Netanyahu, and then he'll interview some dude in the Gaza Strip, and then it's just going to be wild. But did you see the episode he put out with Mark Zuckerberg that was all done in Meta?
I heard about it. I've heard pieces of it audio wise. I have not looked at the video.
You need to like watch that at some point. Honestly, like, I can literally pull it up. I might pull it up later in the episode, because it's like, if you were ever going to go online, that's how you would have to do it, because it's so freaky how realistic, like, it's nuts. It's so nuts. But anyway, hey everybody, welcome to the Post-Military Podcast. I am here today with a guest that I'm really excited about. He is someone who has been doing what I'm doing longer than me. He has a podcast down in Southern California, the Transition Drill Podcast. He's the host. His name's Paul Pantani. And when he's not spitting fire on the mic with all of his guests, he has worked as a cop and detective for which city, sir?
I'm in Riverside County.
In Riverside County for, I believe, 30 years. Yes?
Little over 30. Just crossed over to my 31st year as a cop, about close to 35 in law enforcement.
That's incredible. So, a storied career in law enforcement, and we will get into his story here soon. But you might say, Billy, you generally have vets on this podcast. What gives? Paul has an amazing mission with the Transition Drill Podcast. He interviews veterans and law enforcement about their transition, much like this show. And if you have not seen it yet, I highly recommend checking it out. He puts out amazing content, really high quality stuff, and has had some incredible guests on. And he was kind enough to come on this show. Paul, thanks so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So the first thing that I would love to know is, tell me, why did you want to go into law enforcement?
I wish I could give you some super razoo answer. I don't know, in the sense that I've got nobody in my family that was law enforcement. I didn't have the greatest interactions with law enforcement as a kid. Nothing to the point where I could have gone to jail, so to speak, but I was a bit of a knucklehead and had my run-ins. And so there were some instances where it was close, but I tell people I was raised to fear my dad more than I would ever fear any police officer. So that kept me right at that line of trouble. And then the few times that I did interact with cops, I was definitely polite and yes, sir, no, sir, and everything else. But digging deeper into it, I'm sure there's some sort of psychologist who's out there who would dig into why I wanted to do it. And it comes back to not having the greatest relationship with my dad, especially into my teenage years. And there was an incident where the school sent home the form, hey, let the police search your lockers, and then you need a parent to sign it. And jokingly, I made a comment to my dad, can you believe they want to search our lockers? And he was very adamant of let them search it anytime they want to. And I think that moment, I was already thinking that I wanted to be a cop, but that kind of solidified it for me. Like, my dad was never somebody who was pro police or anti police. He was almost indifferent to it. But that really showed me like, oh, there's a level of respect there. So I'm sure from a psychological standpoint, that was probably the icing on the cake for me.
Mm-hmm. And when would you say that how long were you into your law enforcement career when you would say that you really bought into the law enforcement, I don't want to say lifestyle, but like the value system and that ethos? When do you really feel like that became like Paul and it became one and the same?
So this contradicts what I said previously in the sense that even as a high school kid and barely graduating high school because I wasn't applying myself, I was more interested in hanging out with my friends, borderline getting into trouble. But I was raised with a strong sense of values and a real strong sense of what's right and what's wrong. And going into law enforcement, that was already there. It wasn't like something turned on when I became a cop. It was just, this is just me. And so it was a very easy transition for me to then start enforcing the law.
That makes a lot of sense. And so what has it been like for you working in Riverside County for 35 years? That's a significant amount of time to be working a very difficult job in the same place for that long.
For me, it's been a great career. I have no regrets. I've been very fortunate in the things that I've been able to do. I've promoted up through leadership. I'm now a commander, so I oversee divisions. And for me, I heard it said once that there are some people who are just called to be police officers. And it's not my identity. It's never been who I try to define myself as. I've always, for whatever reason, and I can't tell you how this started, I've always looked at it as this is just my job. And when I'm not working, I'm just Paul. I'm not the cop who's off duty. And because of that, I've been able to have a great career in the sense that doing a lot of things, seeing a lot of things, good and bad. But at the end of the day, it's still just a job for me. It's something that I enjoy doing, but when I'm at home or away from the job, I don't take it with me.
And why do you think you, trying to be that psychologist again, why do you think you have the ability to separate those two things? Because much like the military, I feel like law enforcement is something that requires a level of buy-in that most jobs don't include, and your community generally comes from where you work as well. So how, in spite of that, have you been able to keep those things separate?
You hit the nail on the head in the sense that what the community expects. When I started my career, I actually started in LA County and I transitioned over to Riverside County about midway through. So I started with a local police department. And it was for LA County, as big as LA County is, and most agencies there are decent size. It was considered a smaller agency, a bedroom community, quote unquote. And what that taught me, two parts. At that time, going on 35 years ago now, the older senior officers were very senior. It wasn't an agency where there was a lot of turnover when I first started. And so it was not uncommon to work with people who had 15, 20 years on across the board. It wasn't a very young agency. And so you learned from day one how to do police work. And I'm going to put it in air quotes. And what I mean by that is enforce the laws, but don't enforce your opinion. And one of the things that really drove it home during my training was one of my training officers told me this, that you can get into a fight with somebody and have to prove you're bigger and badder, whatever you want to put it in. Understand this, though. Where do most people, if you were to take the average person to jail, and when they come out of jail, where are they going to go back to? They're going to go back home. And so now the next time you deal with them, it's going to be more adversarial. And on top of that, what's going to be the impact to the next officer that has to contact them? So I learned from a very early point in my career is just do your job. Treat people with respect. Let them dictate how the interactions are going to go. And remember that you're out here to protect the community and enforce the laws. You're not out here to enforce your opinion, and you're not out here to show how tough you are or anything like that. It was more of just be a person and treat people like they are people. And that's served me for 30 plus years.
I think that it's funny that you say treat people like people. I feel that is getting harder and harder as we as a society and honestly species move more and more online, where I feel that people feel that they can just say whatever they want on the internet, and people then get used to just saying truly horrendous things to people without any repercussions. Cause like, you're an intimidating looking guy, and I would not want to say anything to you if we were in the same room together, but here we are. And so that distance provides courage that I don't believe should exist. So
I know that the common term is the keyboard warriors. It's very easy for people to be tough or boisterous, or whatever word you want to use behind a keyboard. That, especially when I was growing up, I know I've got a few more years on you, that you learned your mouth will get you in as much trouble as it'll get you out of. And if you say the wrong thing to the wrong person, you're going to get a punch in the mouth or a fight. And so I think we've lost a little bit of that. I think compounding it, though, is this electronic world that we live in is isolated all of us. And so it's also just a sense of a lack of what I would say is respect, because like you said, we're not in the same room with people as much anymore, especially now we've got the ability to interact with so many more people virtually. And so we don't understand the importance of respect. It's got nothing to do with the size of the other person or whether or not they could or could not handle themselves in a fight. It just comes down to the end of the day, just treat people with respect. And it would cause, I believe, so much of the angst in our society to go away.
I would completely agree with that. It's sad that more people don't have respect for other people's opinions, and for whatever reason, people can't exist in like people feel like they can't exist with an opinion if they know that someone else is around them with a differing opinion. It's impossible to do that, which is crazy to think about. And I don't know. My wife's pregnant, and I think about stuff like this a lot because I'm about to have my first kid. So it's
Congratulations.
oh, thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm about to be a girl dad, so that's gonna be a whole thing that
that'll change your life. That'll change your life.
Everyone says it just like you said it, and I know it's gonna be just so much more crazy than anything anyone has told me to. I don't even know what it's gonna be like when I'm holding that girl for the first time, but it's gonna be. I don't know what my expectation is. I just know it's going to be more than whatever I think it's going to be. So another thing that makes you incredibly unique to this show is This podcast, you're the first person that we've ever talked to who's still in their career. You have yet
Yes.
to leave law enforcement. And yet you have a podcast that focuses on talking about transition. And a question that I ask a lot of my guests is, what could you have told a younger version of yourself to take this transition seriously? And you're an actual living example of, you're taking this process of transition seriously before you ever get there. And so I would love to know, what's the story behind, like, you not just taking your transition seriously, but starting your show?
So there's not a simple answer to that question. I'm going to start by saying how I got into doing this podcast. It was the middle of COVID. My former chief came up with the idea of, let's get our retirees as a resource group for those who are coming towards their retirement to be able to reach out, ask questions, be, in a sense, quasi mentors, in the sense that for those who have transitioned and gone on to do something else, as opposed to retiring and just going to play golf. And that was where it all originated from. Like I said, it was middle of COVID. The plan was to do these kind of like how we're doing this virtually, create these little chat sessions, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, where the retiree could come in and give advice or tips or on their experience making their transition out. And so I did a couple, because I already enjoyed listening to podcasts, it sounded interesting. I just took the lead on it. And a couple of them into it, I started getting emails from, because we just kept it in-house. It was just other members of my organization getting emails from people. Hey, you do a really good job. You should think about actually doing a podcast. And so I just started doing research on it. What's it going to take to put out a podcast? I quickly realized that where my initial jump in would have been the first responder community, because that's where I'm more comfortable with. But the one thing I quickly realized that we share in both the veteran community and the first responder community is, most important, these jobs don't last forever. You are going to have a transition point at some point in time. The other thing is that both entities do a great job of luring us in and telling us all the cool things that we're going to be able to do in our careers. But when it's time to exit, it's basically, hey, don't let the door hit you on your way out. And so with that, I quickly realized, okay, I want to focus on the first responder and veteran community. The other thing is, the veteran community that's different than the first responder community is, the military builds in life evaluations, whether it be every 4 years at the end of an enlistment, if you're an officer, when your EAS is up, and you basically are forced to reevaluate. Okay, what do I want to do? I'm 6 years in, another enlistment's going to put me right at 10. Then it's at that point of, man, do I want to go 20 or do I want to go to 30? And so there's those built-in points of reevaluating your life. Whereas the first responder community, for the most part, you sign on the dotted line on day one, and it's basically fold this up, put this away, and we'll see you in 20 or 30 years for your gold watch and your exit out. And so with that, it really opened up a lot of options for me to be able to talk to people. With my proximity to San Diego, I have an abundance of former Navy, former Marines. And so if you go back and look, those are definitely the bulk of my veteran community guests so far.
Yeah. And if this is your first time ever hearing Paul talk, he's really got a amazing stable of, was it 116 episodes now? Somewhere in there.
I think we're at 115 this week.
115. Hey, there you go. I was close. Okay. And a lot of these guys and gals that you've got on this show are incredible people.
I have been very fortunate to be introduced to some amazing guests, and not all of them are what would be deemed 100-mile-an-hour guests. And what I mean by that is, yes, I've had Navy SEALs, I've had MARSOC Raiders, but I've also had men and women who did 4 years and struggled with their transition, left maybe not because they wanted to leave, left because and these are the veteran community, but because the family demands. My guest this week, he was in the Air Force 4 years, had some drama with his then kid's mom, and he was forced to get out because he had to look at it as, if I stay in and I deploy, where are my kids going to be? And so I've talked to several, a former Green Beret who had to give up all of that training, he was at the quote unquote tip of the spear, but his family needed him more. And so he had to walk away from it. I've talked to first responders who have had not the best exit because they made poor decisions and they quote unquote lost their career. But for me, what's most important is to present people who take ownership of any mistake that they made and allow them to now give back by being a voice of reason. Hey, don't do what I did. The other thing that I focus on equally, it's a two-part thing when I put this together. Start thinking today about your transition tomorrow, because tomorrow is going to happen. Whether it's literally tomorrow, injure yourself, blow out a knee, blow out a back, whatever, or it's 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, at least start thinking about what you might want to do and start making preparations towards it. But equally important, and this is one of the things I'm sure in the military you see it, but even somebody who goes in right when they're 18 and does 20 years, they come out in their 38, they're really not that quote unquote old. Whereas in the first responder community, you come in when you're 21, 22, 23, and you do 30 years, you're now talking somebody who's 55, pushing 60. And there definitely is an age component. And where I'm going with this is, as much as you need to be thinking about your preparation and your transition for tomorrow, today you need to take care of yourself physically, and especially over the last, let's say 5 years with the increase in suicides. Take care of that Rubik's Cube that's between your ears. And if you don't know how to fix that puzzle or solve that puzzle yourself, it's okay to say, hey, I need some help. And that doesn't mean you're a failure. So those are the two components that I really focus on, is the importance of preparing for your transition, as well as the importance of taking care of yourself.
Which I think are two components that are, man, so overlooked, I think, is probably the best way to say it. I love the observation that you just brought up about, I never thought about the fact that no one's asking a cop, hey man, ready for your 5-year re-up? And then they're like, I don't know. That's crazy. You just have your head down, and then all of a sudden you look around and you're done. Hey, great, 3 decades, bye. And so I want to get into those two things that you focus on, but for you, diving into that mentality of just like head down for 3 decades in the first responder community, what impact have you observed from people who especially aren't thinking about their transition? All of a sudden they just get ejected into society. What's that look like from the first responder community? Because a lot of my guests are they're very veteran focused. So I would love to understand what our brothers and sisters in like law enforcement are going through.
So you definitely see the gamut. And I would imagine your experience to a degree is probably saw it a little bit in the military for those very senior, especially maybe like your senior enlisteds who kept their head down, quote unquote, for 20 years. But from my experience, it really runs a very broad gamut. I think one of the biggest things that we fail ourselves, both in the first responder and in the veteran community, is the longer we're in, the more we isolate ourselves, the more we stay within our quote unquote group, because we get into this false sense of security that these are the only people that understand me. And I tell people all the time, the best change for me happened when I became a detective. And the reason is because detectives work Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. And what it allowed me to do was to reestablish relationships with friends who had quote unquote normal jobs, plumbers, bankers, office workers, who had weekends and evenings off, as opposed to me being a young cop working Friday, Saturday, Sunday night shift And the only people that I could hang out with were other cops because they were the ones that were off Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So what you'll find is it's real easy early in your career to get into that mold. It's just a nature of the beast because that's the shift you're going to work. There's no way around it. When you're a 1-year cop or a 1-year firefighter, you're not getting the prime shifts. You're getting the crap shifts. And it's a double-edged sword. Weekend nights is fun. There's a lot to do. You're running around call to call, and it's fun. But if you don't force yourself to, it's like snorkeling. If you don't force yourself to get your head back up above water and reorient yourself and get your bearings, it's easy to dive deeper. And then before you know it, I don't necessarily want to say you're disgruntled, but you're definitely in more of a realm of nobody understands me. The only people who understand me are other cops, other firefighters, other first responders. And I'm not saying to not have that social circle, but you can't just make that your social circle. You got to do those things that keep you normal. And so in my career, I've seen those people who do a good job of keeping a good work-life balance. And I've seen those others that the job is the only thing that identifies them. And they come to the end of their career, they come to that 30-year mark, and those are the ones who die within 3 or 4 years because they have nothing else in their life.
You definitely see similar things with the veteran community, especially with the isolation. And one thing that makes us unique is because we have to move so much. I think we really get in our head. Don't invest in people that are in the community because you're just going to fly away, which I think is really bad because you can get involved in churches, you can get involved in jujitsu gyms or at like hobby. There are things that are worth investing your time into to diversify that community because I think that I completely agree with you. That's so important. And something that I'm interested in, have you seen, at least in the veteran community, something that I've seen is as people deploy or see action, like the closer you get to bang, the more isolated you get because you go like the amount of people that will understand me and this very specific experience gets smaller and smaller. And so have you seen something similar in the first responder community as well?
That's a great question. And the best example that I've heard is, yes, the closer you are to bang, it's going to touch you. No way around it. And yes, we do take comfort in those that we feel are like us and have experienced the same thing. Whether you be a first responder or a veteran, I think it's the same way. The problem that a lot of people don't think about is the media gives a lot of attention to PTS related to veterans coming home because, yes, war is horrendous. War is horrific. What they see is, I'm not trying to compare it to what I've seen in my career, but for most veterans, you deploy to the Middle East, you go back to Vietnam, you deploy to the jungles. When you come back home to San Diego, when you come back home to the middle of Wyoming, whatever, there's visually, there's probably very little reminders of what you experienced over there. The complete opposite of that. Imagine you are a police officer. Imagine you pull this car over at the intersection of walk and don't walk on Saturday night, and you end up in the knockdown, drag out fight, maybe even to the point that in your mind, it crosses your mind like, oh shit, I might lose my life in this. It ends well. Person goes to jail, you go home safe. But Sunday, you're driving through this same intersection with your family. Do you turn to your kids in the back seat and go, hey kids, you know what happened right here in this intersection less than 12 hours ago? You can't share that with your family. But for the rest of your career, you're going to go through that same intersection for the every day that you're working. And I've talked to several former first responders. That was a huge component of their mental health crisis because they had close friends, whether it be a traffic accident, whether it be a shooting, something where they got injured, and they re-experienced that even subconsciously every time they were back at that same location.
That's, man, that's crazy to think about. I feel like I, f- I feel like as a cop, if I was a cop and that was the situation, I would have like, you almost have to move. You don't like, cause that's not practical, but it's one of those things where, yeah, I don't even know how you would.
I don't think moving is a viable option
Mhm.
because you're going to see stuff in your career. You're going to go to the horrible traffic accident where a little baby dies. You're going to go to a house where a child's been abused or a homicide scene or something. It's the nature of the beast. What we
Mhm.
need to normalize is talking about it.
Mhm.
What I would like to see happen in the law enforcement community, or even with firefighters, you get a young firefighter who's 22 years old and probably not experienced death before, and
Mhm.
all of a sudden they're at their first, let's say, burning building, and now they're dealing with burnt bodies. We need to normalize as part of the, and I'll call it indoctrination, but part of the training is, how did that make you feel? How are you feeling with this? How is this affecting you internally, mentally? And make it okay to say, do you need to take a breather? Do you need to go talk to somebody? Whereas 30 years ago when I started, it was suck it up and, oh, hey, there's another call waiting for you, so go handle it.
Mm. I think that for both communities, first responders and for veterans, I think that the inclusion of that would be so welcome, because especially in the vet community, there is a real stigma with talking about mental health, because if you do, you just get taken off the line, and then someone else is going to go instead of you, or your career is going to get put on hold, or it almost is, there are tools that disincentivize you to raise your hand and say, what just happened to me really messed me up and I need to take a second. And I agree. I wish, and even in the veteran community or even in the people like the retiree community, I don't think enough people find folks to say, the stuff that I saw or did really tuned me up and I need help right now, like really bad.
But I do, and I'll use two examples that I
Of
believe
course.
everybody can relate to. Are you old enough to remember more people smoking?
Yes.
So I can go back to when I started in law enforcement. It was common for many of the cops be smoking while they were on duty, smoking their car, out on a
Hmm.
call, they were smoking. Without anything more than just a societal shift, show me somebody who smokes today. How many people
Yeah.
do you know that smoke cigarettes on the regular? It's
Very
not
few.
that it's not that people were actively shamed into to not smoking. It just became more normal in society to not.
Hmm.
The other example I'll use, if you're a football fan, they have the concussion protocols today. They have the limits on the types of hits that players can do. They wear the extra padding on the helmets during practice. I'm sure when they first started implementing those, there were people like, oh, but now it's becoming normal. And every new football player that comes into the NFL, that's going to become normal. And the old guys are eventually going to fade away. And where I'm going with this is, if we, as organizations, both from the military and the first responder side, start normalizing asking people, how do you feel? And we just make that the norm, 20 years from now, it will just be the standard.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd like to believe that it's moving in the right direction. I think that when I was getting out of the service, it certainly was. And definitely in the veteran community, I think that there's been a huge push for people to talk about suicide awareness, seeking help. There's just some amazing nonprofits that exist now for people to plug themselves into. So I do believe that we are seeing that shift, which I think is really awesome. And it gives me hope, to say the least.
I've had a guest Jess Kazada, and she's Marine. And one of the things that she said that really drove it home is we need to stop comparing trauma, in the sense that you can't compare your trauma or what traumatized you to somebody else. And just because somebody else may have done something more than you doesn't entitle them to be more, I don't want to say accepting, but in the sense that they're not more entitled to trauma over the next person. Trauma is trauma. And if you're stuck in a base and it's constantly getting mortared, but you're not leaving the wire, you can't say that doesn't traumatize somebody, just as opposed to somebody who was leaving the wire and going out on patrol. Oh, they're more no, trauma is trauma, and we can't compare it. We have to not make it a competition. And she did it almost kind of in a ladder. Well, I experienced this. Well, you experienced this. Well, it's not a competition.
I wish more people saw it that way, but there's definitely people who look at folks and you either do it as a way to beat yourself down, where you go, I just had X happen to me while I know a guy who has no legs. Or the reverse happens, which is this happened to me and it was way worse than this guy and he's getting benefits too. So what's the deal? And we tear each other apart, and going back to what you said earlier, there is benefit in diversifying your community, but at the same time there is a community of people who get what you're going through, and you don't want to alienate yourself by pointing them and going like, you suck. And it's not comparing trauma, I think, is so incredibly important. And two things you've just mentioned, which is not comparing trauma and vocalizing when things have happened. Are there other things that you have seen from your guests or in your professional career that people have done that have really allowed them to tackle these mental problems that have stuck with you?
First and most important is, and you've already hit on this, it's becoming more commonplace. It's becoming more normal to say, I need help. I need to talk to somebody, as opposed to just sitting on it and letting it fester and eat you from the inside out. So I do believe we're seeing a positive change in that direction. From the first responder community, I'm seeing, and this is still more of the bigger agencies that have the ability to do this, they're putting counseling staff in the building, and they're just there all the time. And pretty soon they become normal. And what I mean by that, and I've heard it jokingly referred to, we become the plant in the corner. People just get used to us being there, and they stop thinking about, oh, there's the doctor. And after a while, it becomes a lot easier for somebody to go knock on the door. Hey, doc, you have 5 minutes. I need to talk to you. As opposed to, all right, the psychologist is going to be here next Thursday at 3 p.m. Everybody line up who wants to talk to him. The other thing that I'm definitely seeing from the veteran community that I really hope we can move forward as a country is the benefits of psychedelics. It's being proven every day. And I've had guests who have had to go down to Mexico and do psychedelic retreats, but they all say it helps. And I think what we're still dealing with here in this country is the residual of the 60s and the impression that psychedelics had back then, as opposed to truly evaluating them for their medical benefit and listening to the people that have done psychedelics and how it's helped them. I've talked to a couple veterans who have done it, and I said, would this be something that would be, because they were tier 1, former Green Beret, they were a Raider from the Marine Corps. And so I asked them, I said, would this be something that you would recommend doing on the regular throughout your career? And no, that would not be a good thing, because unfortunately, when you are at the tip of that spear, and the way they referred to it is, when I need to kick a door, I need to be that big bad wolf. And so they don't recommend doing it mid-career, but they all say, hey, when I'm about a year out and I know that I'm done, pull me off the line, put me through this therapy, and let me exit the military in a much better mental space.
I've talked to individuals who have done the psychedelics, and I had a guest on very recently, or his episode came out very recently, and he was talking about how as someone who is on the front lines, whether you're on the home front or you're out in other parts of the world, you have to do things, you have to get dirty to get the dirt. And you can't it's like the way that he said it, which I thought was really funny, is he was like, that first step into the mud, you're like, oh no, I'm clean. But then once you're muddy, you're like, here I am, like I'm here now. And he's like, these things allow you to clean yourself, and it would be counterproductive because then you would have to just get dirty again. So it definitely jives with what you're saying. But I've talked to some people, and man, they're like, this stuff is great. And I saw something about the VA using, like the VA had, I think I saw a VA thing about psychedelics. I like, do not quote me on that, anyone who's listening to this. But I thought I saw it, which was really interesting, but I didn't look into it. So hopefully that's something that's coming out soon. I completely agree with you. There's so much research coming out. At some point, it's like, guys, like, come on, let's check this out. I'm hopeful that we'll start to see more wide acceptance of treatments like that, because that would just be really fast, really amazing. Something that I'm interested in, and we were going back to the discussion about community. You talked about how you had a real shift when you got off the beat and you became a detective, and that allowed you to diversify your community. What was that like for you doing that for the first time after working? Is like, was it hard? And do you have any recommendations for people based off of what either your life experience or what you've learned from your podcast on how people can build that diverse community while they're serving and what after they get out?
So the simple answer to that question is I'll go way back to where I said, when I'm not working, I'm just Paul. I'm not the cop who is Paul. And the example that I'll use, and that I tell people this all the time, get away from the first responder community. Could you tell a doctor walking down the street when they're not working? More than likely not. A plumber? More than likely not. Because when they're not working, they don't want to be thinking about work. But we, when we're not working, are in our 511 pants. We're in our camo hat with the bill bent down. And my wife jokes about it in the sense that she'll tell me all the time. She goes, you might think that you don't look like a cop. People know you're a cop because you just have that bearing. There's no way to get rid of that because, and real briefly, I want to jump back to what you were saying, and I don't want to make a cliche about it, but it has been said. The jobs are bad. The jobs, like you said, are muddy. And unfortunately, you need a wolf at the door with bigger teeth who's going to go fight that wolf. There's no way to make these careers, whether it be the military or first responder community or careers, that you can take that away. So yes, you are going to be playing in the mud your entire time in your career. You got to figure out a way to make it work for you and not eat you alive. So going back to that is make your job, make being a military member just your job, not your identity, so that when you do no longer have it, you don't feel lost, or you don't feel that, man, that's all that defines me. Define yourself by being a good father, by being a good mother, by being a brother, a husband. Make everything outside of the job what defines you. Get into hobbies. This is real easy to do today. In most podcasts, everybody's doing jujitsu. I do jujitsu and I love it. And I fight myself to not be the raw, hey, everybody go do jujitsu, but it's good. It's good from the health and fitness side of it. It's good from the self-defense side of it. And it's good for the mental side of it. But find those things. If you like to fish, go fishing. If you like to race cars, go race cars. Find something to do that makes you normal and puts you in a circle of people who, yeah, there may be other veterans in that community. There may be other first responders in that community, but there may also be the guy who's driving a bakery truck or a woman who makes pottery. Who knows? Force yourself into groups so that you don't just define yourself by your job. As a detective, I enjoyed it. I loved it. But for me, I worked at a small organization, and when you're a young 20-something-year-old in the academy in a front-leaning arrest position, the last thing you're thinking about is work in fraud. Who wants to deal with a stack of papers? I stumbled into it by accident, and I found that I loved it. And so that's the path that I went down. And I went deep into computers, computer forensics, fraud. But at the same token, I still kept my foot in the tactical side, been involved in emergency response teams. Today I command our office's ERT team. So I've kept my foot on both sides of it. But you have to find enjoyment in these careers. You're not going to do 20 or 30 years if you don't like what you're doing. But at the same token, always be thinking, does what I'm doing that's really fun today translate when I leave? And what opportunities is it going to give me in the outside world? I'll use the law enforcement side. There are a lot of guys who love being canine officers. What does a canine officer do when they leave law enforcement, other than maybe train other canine dogs? There's not many companies throwing out job advertisements for a canine handler. And I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying maybe just make it a small piece of your career and move on.
Yeah. Why do you think because I don't think this is a military or a first responder specific issue. I think it's more exacerbated by our like our career as a lifestyle. But why do you think it's so hard for people to think about the next thing? Whatever comes, whatever the next chapter is, I just think that we as a society, we really struggle with, maybe call it delayed gratification, maybe call it like future planning, whatever. Why do you think that we as a society have such a hard time of thinking about, okay, what comes next, and then making plans for future Paul or future Billy or future whoever?
I think that's definitely a complex question with a lot of different angles that you could come at it from. So I'm going to try to keep my thoughts in line. The first area that I'm going to focus on is I'm going to focus on the personal side, in that we get somewhere that we like and we get comfortable and we don't want to give it up. Man, I really like doing this. Why do most people, and you can talk to this from the military side, but I would imagine it's the same. You get to that rank level, the E5, or and maybe in some of the first responder communities, you get to that corporal level where you're not really a supervisor, but you've got some seniority and you can just cruise. And you really don't want to challenge yourself, because they look at anything that they're not doing as, oh, that's not as fun. So we're captivated by the moment. Hey, I really like what I'm doing right now, and I don't want to stop doing this. The other thing is, I think in general, we aren't raised. I think most kids are raised by their mom and dad of go to school, get a good job, work towards your pension. And there really isn't this encouragement of, what do you want to do? And take that back, because I'm dealing now with my kids who are off to college, and you have to fight this battle as a parent of, so what do you want to study when you go to college? And like, I'm 18 years old. I don't know what I want to do when I'm 40, but you want to lock me into a college degree that's going to lock me. But our normal pattern is make a decision today and stick with it. That's not how it should be. And I even say this to the first responders, and I pointed this out previously, where the one thing that's cool about the military is they force you to reevaluate your life every few years. First responder community, it's on you. And I'll tell you, I've had some guests who, man, I was 8-10 years into it, and just wasn't my passion. My heart wasn't in it. And I commend those who say, you know what, this isn't for me. I'm now becoming a danger to my partners because maybe my head's not in the game. I'm going to walk away from this, as opposed to I'm just going to bear down and become disgruntled because I don't really like it, and I'm going to ride it out for 20 or 30 years. The other thing I would say is we are driven by our egos. These are both careers that offer many of us the ability to go, look at me and look at all the cool things I can do. And so once you get to that point, it's that feeding your ego. It's being able to brag that I'm on the SWAT team. I'm on this quick response team. I work homicide, whatever. There's a little bit of that ego that comes into play. Great. Feed that ego, but always be looking yourself in the mirror and go, does this benefit me when I walk away from this job? And if it does, then go headlong into it and make yourself the best at that, so that when it comes time to transition, you are very easily sellable to whoever's looking for you.
The thing that resonates with me with the most there, and the thing that I've seen, is I think people really don't like thinking about resetting from their peak, because when you get out of law enforcement or when you get out of the military, like, you literally exit at the highest point in your career. And because the military or law enforcement is really different than most job, like, unless you go into private security or like something like that, you really are, there is some drop off before you can start gaining altitude again. And I really think people don't want to think about oh my God, I have to do something hard again. Like, I don't want to have to do that. I don't want to have to start working the graveyard shifts again. That sounds terrible. So I really do think that's the thing that people love thinking about, the happy them, not the unfortunately sad them. So
I know in my experience in talking to not former first responders, just people who work in corporate America, but let's say in financial institutions where they're often hiring former law enforcement for investigators. I've talked to a lot of them, and one of the biggest complaints they have is, we come in the door after 30 years of being a cop, and every day we have to remind everybody, hey, I used to be. And the thing is, yes, you used to be. You're no longer. Enjoy your memories. Maybe every once in a while share a story, but don't make it every day of your life, hey, I used to be.
Yeah, and because no one's gonna understand, and you just sound weird. Like, don't expect people who weren't also in the business to understand the business. It's just what it is, and that's just part of moving on from the last thing that you did in your life. But again, I also understand the flip side, which is like, you put in 30 phenomenal years of service to your state, your city, your county, your nation, and you should be proud of that. And it's always this very interesting conversation of what's too much and what's self-loathing. Like, where's the line of being proud of your service, but not, this is who I am. This is who I'm, Mr. Thin Blue Line, or I'm Mr. Veteran, I'm Mr. Grunt Style, or whatever. I don't know. I think it's an interesting debate that I don't know where
that's the teeter-totter that we ride on when we exit these careers. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
there are going to be times where you're going to want to talk about your previous career, but be mindful of it. Put yourself in a situation, let's say you're in a dating relationship with someone. Imagine how you'd feel if every day they talked about the person that they used to date. Now, obviously, the person they used to date every once in a while is probably going to come up in conversation, but are they going to bring it up every single day? And why are they bringing it up? Are they bringing it up because they're trying to remind you and remind themselves of that relationship? Then go back to that relationship. I know that's an oversimplified way of looking at it, but that's how people who aren't veterans or who aren't former first responders kind of look at us sometimes, when every day we're talking about the I used to be's.
Yeah, for sure. Something that you said earlier that I want to dig into is you said you really respect the guys and the gals who have the awareness to go, I need to leave. Like I need to punch out of this situation. And I see this a lot. I saw this a lot in the military, especially in cyber, where like your life's really not at risk. Like maybe it floods and you get electrocuted. Or worst case, the air conditioning goes out in the building. Like those are our high risk scenarios as cyber professionals. You see a lot of people who actively hate the fact that they're in the military. They actively hate the fact that they're in cyber warfare and they have been there for decades. And you go, why are you here? And they just stay. And so, what do you think it takes for people to have the self awareness to be able to pull themselves out of a bad situation? Yeah, from either side that you've seen from your guests and from your personal experience.
It takes a strong sense of personal conviction to admit that maybe you made a bad decision. I'm sure some of it is a little bit of fear based because you get so deep into your career that you might take it as, I don't really know how to do anything else. And if I walk away from this, what are my options? Or, like you said, man, I've gotten comfortable. I'm a senior NCO. Life's easy for me. I'm on easy street. I cruise along. I got people below me who do most of the dirtier work. I like this position in life that I'm in. I may not like the work that I'm doing, but I like the benefits or the perks that come with it. And so they talk about EQ, your emotional intelligence. You have to develop that. It's definitely something that I don't think we're encouraged to develop as we're growing up. This thing of introspection and how does my place in life or what I'm doing impact me? And the bigger aspect to that is that by not doing that, you end up being that disgruntled person who's got a horrible home life. You've got probably a horrible work life because you're not happy and people don't want to be around you. So you're probably flying off the handle at the drop of a hat. You're probably drinking more than you probably should. You're probably indulging in things that are not necessarily good for you on a more frequent basis because you're not at peace on the inside. And I don't think we inherently or instinctually have that built into us. It's something that we have to work on. And so, in combination with that, it's got to be encouraged by our spouses, by our friends, by our colleagues at work, by our bosses at work of how do you like where you're at right now? How is where you're at feeding you personally? Do you feel fulfilled? Do you feel like you have goals and aspirations? Or are you literally looking at a date on a calendar for when you can walk out the door? And maybe have that crucial conversation with your subordinates, or maybe you have that crucial conversation with your spouse or significant other and say, if you're not happy, I support you. Let's make a change to make you happy.
The crucial conversations and being encouraged to evaluate where you're at is so incredibly important. But then it goes back to that courage aspect of you might be far along, you might be experienced, the reset's always really scary for people. And like you said, it really does take moral courage and a lot of fortitude, which is why it's so rare, I believe. But it's something that more people need to have to be able to make that decision to leave a job regardless of the impact. And it's easy if you just view your job as a job because you can recover from that. But if you view your job as your life or your value or whatever, then losing your job means losing part of your identity or it reflects upon your identity, and then people can't deal with that. And it's really hard.
And what I think drives that home is, okay, fine. You make it all the way to retirement. You retire. and now you're wallowing in. You're stuck in this, man, I miss it. Man, that used to be me. Man, I was this. But let's go to the opposite side. Like I said earlier. So you're running at 100 miles an hour. You love what you're doing. It defines you and everything. And literally tomorrow, you blow out your back. And the military says, hey, it's not completely debilitating, but it's debilitating enough that you can no longer be in the military. Or you're a first responder. Hey, you can no longer be a firefighter. And now what? Now you're forced into trying to find something else. So all I'm saying is, if you take the time to think about it, if you force yourself to say, if I lost this career tomorrow, I don't want to lose it, but if I did, what would I do? And I think it's an easier decision when this today isn't your 100% identity.
You're a very insightful guy. You got a lot of amazing thoughts. Currently, we've heard 1 hour and 3 minutes of them. How much of this has come from your time recording your show for 115 episodes? And how much of it do you think you had going into this project?
I definitely brought some of it to the table in that when I made that jump, when I was tapped on the shoulder and said, hey, you really need to think about promoting and moving into that management position, it coming up on close to 10 years now. The change in me was weird in that I knew that I wanted to be a supervisor and I knew that I wanted to lead teams, but I didn't realize how much enjoyment I would get by being the guy in the rear with the gear, just making sure that my teams had what they needed and was more of that guiding light as opposed to the dictator boss. And I started seeing the importance of, as a leader, taking care of your people. And that just became 100% what it's all about for me. I love the jobs that I've done. I went from, like I said, I went from being a supervising investigator to a commander. So now I went from leading teams to leading divisions. But it's the same thing. It's take care of your people. Make sure your people have what they need to get the job done, but let them take the credit for it. You're not, it's the thing of, you don't have to tell somebody how to do it. You just need to tell them what they need to get done and let them get from A to Z. They may not do it in the same steps you do it. They may not go A, B, C, D, but as long as they get to Z, what do you care? And so it really opened my eyes as to how important it is to be a leader and to not generalize it or undermine it in any way. But it's like being a parent. You want the best for your children, the same way you want the best for your subordinates. You want them to succeed. You want to make people that tomorrow, when you're not here, which you will not be here tomorrow, that there's somebody that can take over your seat and do it as good, if not better than you. But so many people, when they get to, again, it's that ego thing. They rise in rank, and now the rank becomes their identity. And they're going to tell you what their rank is, and they're going to tell you how the cow ate the cabbage because they are in charge. And again, it's just keeping that ego in check. The other thing for me, and I mentioned this previously, is seeing the number of suicides that we're addressing both in the first responder and the veteran community. My people's mental health is a huge priority to me. And I always, like the people who work for me, if they've got something going on at home, my first response is always take care of your family first. This work will be here. This job will be here, but your family is what you need to take care of. And so making sure that they understand that they take care of themselves first is my first priority. Wow. Um, That's a hard answer because I've learned a lot of things from a lot of people. The biggest thing is resilience. The biggest thing is you're going to face adversity. I've had the opportunity to interview a Navy SEAL who lost his hand and redeployed with a prosthetic. I've had the opportunity to interview a Green Beret who's lost virtually his entire right leg and redeployed with a prosthetic leg. And those are very easy stories to jump on and say, wow, look at that resilience. But the thing that I'm equally impressed by, somebody who was a Raider 15 years into their career, loving what they were doing, but his wife had kidney issues and being home to take care of his family was more important to him. And so he walked away from his career. Taking ownership of your mistakes. I've talked to people who have been asked to leave their careers because of mistakes they made. And instead of turning their back and blaming the organization and blaming the military and blaming the first responder community, what did they do? They stood up and they said, I'm going to continue giving back to those communities because I love those communities. I just made a mistake. The biggest thing for me, though, is the number of people that I've talked to who didn't live picture perfect careers, or picture perfect lives. But in talking to them and hearing their stories, you could see no matter how far or how close they got to that edge of making bad mistakes and bad decisions, they had a good moral compass. And coming back and thriving when, if you look at it on paper, they should have failed. They should have never been able to succeed. But it's that internal drive that kept them going and allowed them to achieve greatness.
The resilience of the people you wouldn't expect is really awe-inspiring, because you can look at that person and go, like when you were talking about the folks who, like that airman who got out because he wanted to make sure that his kids were taken care of. A lot of people can listen to that and go, damn, that's me. That could be me. And it's just so powerful to see those people have a strong understanding of their values and then choose to act upon those values with conviction, regardless of the possible negative outcomes that might incur, or the loss of some lesser value that they had in their stack that just didn't happen to supersede something that they were more like they found more important. And all of those stories that I've heard, and especially for me, I'm not even 2 years out of my transition. It's just been listening to your show, listening and talking to the guests that I've had on every single time. Is, man, this is powerful stuff. Like, this is a big deal. And so I completely agree. The resilience is just amazing. Where, going back to your two messages that you push, prep is immediately, start thinking about it now, and take care of yourself. When did you decide that those were your guiding tenets that you would conduct your episodes off of? Was that something that you always had, or did it just molded into that? When did that, like, when did you start building those tenets for your episodes?
I knew right away when I started developing the podcast that the whole point of it was start thinking about what you want. It was driven by what career do you want to move into? And a little bit is selfish on my part. I told you that when I became a detective, I was working fraud, and I started seeing the other side of the fence and the jobs that were available to me, working computer forensics, doing computer-based crime investigations, that even 10 years ago, I was starting to think this would be a good post-law enforcement career. And it happened by accident. I didn't go looking for it, but when it fell in my lap, it's okay. And so I started putting most of my eggs in that basket. That's where I was planning to go to. And so when I came to the idea of the podcast, because I was intending in my narrow focus, I'm just going to talk to a bunch of people who have retired and gone and done something else. Then I started doing the research And I started digging into it and found that, especially from the veteran community, there's a large number, and probably a greater number, that don't, quote unquote, make it to retirement. They do one enlistment, they do 10 years, and for whatever reason, they get out. And so it became more apparent to me that you don't have a bunch of time to be planning or to not be thinking about what you're going to do tomorrow. You can't get into this mindset, I'll deal with it later, because later is going to come quicker than you realize, and you need to be prepared for it. And so I use the term, it's like a roller coaster ride. We all love riding the roller coaster, but we don't get to control when the ride stops. And you would like to ride it all the way to the end, but sometimes the car breaks down and you got to, they say, hey, off, we got to fix this. And now what do you do? So there was a bit of, I'll even call it naiveness, in that I was thinking that I'm just going to talk to a bunch of people who did a career and then they transitioned seamlessly and had no problems. And then when I got into it and really started talking to people, and the number of people that said, my transition sucked. My transition was not when I wanted to do it. It was, and you talk about the airman who left after one enlistment to take care of his family. But in the episode, he said, I didn't want to get out of the service. So there was the selfish component, and we all understand that. Hey, I'm having fun. I like doing this. And anybody who's been a parent, that's a battle that you deal with. Hey, I'd rather be doing A, B, or C, but I got to take the kids to soccer on Saturday morning. I don't want to get out of bed at 6 o'clock. They've got volleyball practice. And so you have to fight that selfish side of what do you want to do as opposed to what does your family need you to do. But I've had many guests who have said, I wasn't prepared for my transition. I didn't plan for my transition. My transition was forced upon me, not when I wanted to do it. But you can't just stick your head in the sand and pretend like it's going to go away and everything's going to be fine. You got to move on. Life's going to happen. And so the sooner you jump on and say, I got to deal with this, the better you're going to be. Now, just take one extra step in that. Start thinking about what you might want to do if that happens today. Maybe you don't even have the time to make changes, or you don't have the ability to get necessary training or something to make that transition, but maybe you do. But if you don't even think about it, how do you know what training you need? The old self-assessment. What are my skill sets? What do they transition to in the outside world? And do I need anything to complement it so that I can get hired easily?
It's tough for people to do, but I wish more people did it. Not to sound like a broken record, I'm sure you've heard at least 115 times. I definitely did not expect my transition to happen. If you would have asked me right before I had a stroke that put me out of the Air Force, I would have told you the day before, I'm doing 20 at least, and I'll figure out what I want to do as an adult after that point. And yeah, and then life reroutes you into something completely different. And by the grace of God, I'm in a better spot. Like, I bumbled my way into a pretty solid situation so hard, it was crazy. But if people ask me, they're like, man, you really crushed it. I was like, I ended up somewhere good, but I think I hit every branch of the tree on the way down to the grounds. I'll just add to the growing list of people that tell you didn't expect it to happen, never thought about it, and then it did, and here I am. So it's crazy.
There's a guest that I had who's a former police officer, and his whole life growing up, I want to be a cop. His dad was a corrections officer. I want to be a cop. At, I want to say 17 years old, he started volunteering. He lived in a smaller town, so the fire department and police department were together. And so he started volunteering at the fire department, thinking that would get him a foot in the door for the police department. Long story short, he became a cop. He was 10, 12 years into his job. He loved being a cop. Gets into a foot pursuit, messes up his knee. Ends up going to the hospital, have to have surgery. It's not the injury to the knee that caused him the issues. It's that in post-recovery, he ended up getting blood clots, which he had no knowledge of, that he was predisposed to blood clots. So now he's got to go on blood thinners. And basically, no. And I'm not trying to say that I like getting people to this point, but I take it as a sign of respect that they trust me enough that he broke down. He's, man, I lost my career. He's turned it around. He got into project management. He's more than excelling now. And one of the questions that I came back around to him was, if you could do it all over again, are you better for your family today or back then? He goes, I'm much better today. And he goes, I wouldn't change it in the world for the world. But at the time, his rug got pulled out from underneath his feet. And to him, you're destroying my life. So we are resilient. The reason why I believe we get into these careers is because we are naturally resilient people. We'll find a way we'll find a solution to the problem. We may not like it at the moment, but we will find a solution. The old adage, we'll adapt and overcome. And more than likely, we'll do better than what we're doing today.
That is 100% what should happen for law enforcement and veterans who exit the service. I think the thing that ties people down, and I've even seen this myself, is I'll have early on, it was every day. I'm getting better, but sometimes I still have days where I just because I was so tied to my work, which was really, I was tied to the service and purpose that the military brought me, but I mentally connected that purpose with a job. I subtly convinced myself that my job is supposed to be this like fountain of purpose and meaning. And so I still have days now where I'll have a bad day at work and it literally just sends me into the dumps. And then I have to catch myself and go, like, my life is great. Like, I'm around my wife way more. I'm in a job where my schedule is fantastic. So when my baby girl is born, I'll be around. Like, these are all objectively better things that a lot of people would kill to have. But I'm letting my identity be consumed by this singular aspect of me. And I have to fight that. And I think that's the thing that chokes out a lot of people's ability to see the value in their life, because they let this one item just consume all other portions of their value set because they were used to it when they were either in the military or as a first responder.
I can definitely tell you that there are a bunch of homicide detectives out there who did homicide for 15, 20 years, who probably have zero memories of their kids growing up. And I guarantee you, they probably regret missing out on baseball games and birthday parties more than they regret maybe not have been a homicide detective. So it's easy we are victims of the moment, and it's easy to get into that mindset. And like you said, you were 100% hook, line, sinker. I am in the military, and it got taken away from you before you were ready to. But maybe that was the best thing for you in the long run.
Oh, it's the best thing that's ever happened to me. Like, I can confidently say that if you're listening, I don't know if who's listening, if you believe in higher power or not, but for me, I do. I believe that God did like that happen, that God allowed that to happen to get me into a place where I was actually healthy enough to have a wonderful life with my family. And I would not have been able to do that in the military, even though that ego death and that values death I had and still are dying. Like, it's worth it, because when I'm being really honest with myself, it's better. It's a better situation. And I'm very blessed to be able to say that. And yeah, it's something that I'm hopeful that veterans everywhere are able to, veterans and first responders are able, like, it's a zen that I hope that people can achieve themselves, for sure. So going into another question I have for you, what are values that you believe are worth grounding yourself in? Because everybody has to have something, as you've stated many times, is for you it's not work. So what do you think it is?
For me, first and most important is integrity. There's nothing, and I 100% wholeheartedly can say this from the bottom of my heart. I've done this job for 30 years, and there's nothing that I look back and say, ooh, that could have gotten me in trouble. You have to be able to do this job with integrity. You got to be able to look yourself in the mirror. There's nobody out there that's worth losing my career, my life, my house, my family for. I can't imagine. And I honestly believe that a lot of the men and women, and I'm going to focus on the first responder community here, but who have done stupid things, and you see it in the news all the time. I'm sure if you could have gone back a week prior, a day prior, or whatever, before they did that incident and said, hey, would you do this and throw away your career? They'd be like, hell no. We make stupid decisions in the moment. And what needs to be more important is your integrity. It's doing the right thing when nobody's watching. Or what my dad used to say, and it's funny, he's not a very philosophical man, but this is the one thing that has always stuck with me. Don't cut yourself shaving because you can't look yourself in the mirror.
Mm.
You know,
That's good. That's a good saying right there.
And that's how I've lived my life, is be a good person, have the integrity to have convictions, but also have the integrity to say what I'm doing is wrong and I need to change it or not do something. We've hit around this, but being an adult sucks, because once you get responsibilities, whether it be to a job, whether it be to a family, sometimes it's harder to make the decision on what's better outside of me than inside of me. And that sucks. But that's what you have to do, is have the integrity to know that you're going to do what's right even when nobody's watching.
That is an amazing value to build your life around, because it allows you to live to a standard that, like you said, you can look back on and be proud of, which is good. Like, you do not want to have regrets as you move from one chapter to another, just as the book closes. So for you, something that people might not know is, well, if they watch the show, they know, but this is the first time watching Paul, you might not know, you film all your episodes in person, and you either travel with your camera equipment or people come to your house. What has been for you one of the wildest like filming stories that you've had to deal with?
So I'm sure, like you look back on every episode you record and you're like, I screwed that up. Like right now, I'm noticing that the light behind me is flickering. I don't know if you're seeing it on your end, but on my camera, it seems like the light's fading in and out, but there isn't a light right here. So I don't know. I don't want to turn around right now while we're recording and try to figure out what's going on, but it's bugging me. And so it's those little things like that. I got to interview a retired Master Chief who grew up as a gang member and went in the Navy and thrived and almost did 30 years. Wrote a book chronicling his life. And again, one of those people that his name is Raul Ramos. The book is Essay to Master Jefe. And the cool thing about it is he's honest about the stupid shit he did as a kid, as a gang member in South Central LA. But again, having, for whatever reason, deep down that natural moral compass that really prevented him from going too far. But in answer to your question, so I went to his apartment in San Diego, and like you mentioned previously, the air conditioning, when you're trying to record a podcast, external noise is not your friend. And so I over rely on my editor to clean up background noises, but I still try to eliminate as many as possible. It's one of those episodes that it's cringeworthy for me, because basically the front end of the recording, because he lived in a high-rise building, it had the natural sound of the ventilation system, and my editor just couldn't clean it up. And so for whatever reason, that first half, it was just really bad. So when you go back and listen to it, it sounds like we're talking in a tin can, and I just hate it. I've had episodes. So one of the guys that I do jujitsu with is an Army veteran who lost part of his right leg and part of his right arm. He still does jujitsu, and he will smash you. Yes. And so we did an interview one morning after class. And so my professor said, yeah, just use my studio. So basically we're just sitting on the mats afterwards. Through the whole interview though, you hear me like, cause you're tired after having doing an hour plus of jujitsu. And it just, I don't like that I'm constantly just taking these big, deep breaths. And I feel like I'm constantly rushing my questions of him. So just little things like that. But on the flip side, the police officer that I told you that lost his career because of a blood clot, the funny thing is we recorded that up in Northern California at my aunt and uncle's house. So we're outside on their balcony, great backdrop, just really nice environment. They never get helicopters flying over their house. As soon as we start recording,
Whoom.
and it's not even like in the perimeter, it literally flies directly overhead. And I even make the comment in the recording, hey, everybody, I'm sorry, waiting for the helicopter to fly over. Well, as a subtle brag, I guess the equipment that I have is so good. When I went back and listened to it, you don't hear the helicopter in the audio. So it's just, little things like that. You're always striving to give. I had somebody tell me that as much as podcast is audio and you have to have good quality sound, bar none, that's what you want to aim for. But the brand of my podcast is also equally the visual component. I wanted to do video from the get-go. I went through various iterations of a single camera to start with. I've recently switched to 2 cameras. My long-term goal is to go to a 3 camera where you get the one long shot every once in a while. But with that, you have to be mindful of your background. But I think that becomes part of your brand. I'll use Jocko, for instance. Jocko's got an aspect of his brand that low light, black and white,
leans over the camera and
where you kind of feel like,
yeah,
it's almost like they're in a dungeon or something.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got, I'll take the Joe Rogan example. All of the stuff that he has on the table that you can see in some of the shots, the background, the neon light, all those little things, people come to get used to that. And that's what kind of they expect. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was just wanting to produce that familiarity with every time they see an episode, that there's certain things that are always there. And I screw it up all the time.
Yeah. But your editor's great and no one will know until you tell them. And I had an episode where I filmed a guy who he camped outside of Starbucks, and by the grace of God, I was able to get all of the audio good. But I started off the episode by saying, hey, if you hear any garbage, sorry. And I ended up getting it so good that people would reach out and go, what are you talking about? I got distracted in the episode because I was listening for whatever you said was there. And I was like, shit, I should have said it. I should have cut that. It is what it is. What do you think is the biggest lesson, not from your guests, but from doing this project that you've learned that you would want to pass on to the listeners now?
Listen more than you talk. One of the things that and trust me, it's not something that comes easy and I have to work on it. Our natural tendency is when somebody says something that you want to respond to, you want to jump in on it. And forcing myself to just sit, listen, let them finish their thought, and then say something. So and it's always a work in progress, but really trying to focus on people are tuning in to my podcast to hear somebody else. They really actually I probably, like you, probably average about an hour and a half. I've had some that have gone really long. I've learned that with the memory cards, you're only going to get so many hours. And so those little things. But the way I look at it is if somebody listens to an hour, I'm hoping that they hear my guest at least 45 minutes of that hour. I just need to direct the conversation and let the guest speak. They're not tuning in to listen to me. They're tuning in to hear the story of my guest. So let my guest control the audio. And what I mean by that is let their voice be what is mostly heard.
The only thing that I would add that I've taken away from it that I'm sure you'll agree with is active listening is a skill and it's exhausting.
Have you done multiple interviews in one day yet?
Yes, I did 3 and it was
How big of a headache did you have?
Oh my God. I messaged the last person. I was like, listen, I'm sorry. And they were like, no, you did great. And I was like, I don't even remember what we talked about. I'm going to edit it, so I'll find out eventually. But yeah, I literally, I closed out the app and I walked out to my wife was hanging out on the couch outside here. And she was like, how are you? And I was like, I don't know where I am right now.
When I first started, you mentioned that everything was portable. Because when I first kicked this off, I knew that people are going to be like, who the hell's Paul Pantani and why the hell am I going to go to him? And so I knew I was going to be going to the majority of my guests. And so I would roll in for a weekend, rent a hotel room, set up it like a makeshift studio, and I would try to knock out 3 or 4 interviews. And I would just get done with those weekends and just be absolutely spent. Because like you said, active listening is actually a lot of work. And you're listening at the same token, you're taking mental notes on where you want the follow-up question to go. And it just is exhausting. And so now what I try to do is try not to do more than one in one day, if possible. But at the end of the day, I have to make myself available, just like you, to my guest schedule. It does me no good to turn on a camera and sit here by myself with no guest. And so if a guest says, hey, I'm available this day, then I try to make it work.
Yeah, it's doing one a day is definitely the move, but I also definitely understand where you're like, I just got to stack these a little bit so that I've got some breathing room. What has kept you going when filming has gotten hard? Because I'm sure you've experienced it. You're many tens of episodes in front of me. Sometimes you're like, you show up, you're excited about this guest, and then the day you get there, you go, man, the last thing I want to do is have a meaningful 3-hour conversation with somebody. And how do you dig deep and provide a meaningful conversation in that point?
2 parts keep me going. The first is the unexpected stories. I'll use one example. I interviewed, he was a Marine, left the Marine Corps. He's now a police officer. And I wanted to talk to him. He hadn't made his quote unquote transition. Yes, he transitioned from the Marine Corps to law enforcement, but he was running a company teaching meditation and mindfulness for first responders. And so I wanted to talk to him about that. And I could have probably done a little bit better research and background on him before we sat down. Long story short, he's of Japanese descent. His father was I believe, the youngest of 6 kids. Pearl Harbor happens. Mom and his dad, who is the youngest, and his immediate older brother are actually in Japan at the time. The rest of the family is here in the United States because they're farmers up in Central California. The older children get placed in internment camps. They got moved from California, I believe, to Wyoming and put in internment camps. The oldest brother gets released when he becomes an adult, immediately goes and this shows you their love of this country. He leaves an internment camp and basically goes and joins the Navy, the U.S. Navy, gets deployed, ends up in Japan with mom and the 2 younger brothers. And there's a family photo of him in his Navy uniform in Japan with the mom and the younger brothers. The hassles to try to get the 3 of them back, the mom and the 2 younger brothers, to this country. Mom is basically at the verge of just giving up. Screw it. We're just going to stay here in Japan. And all the older brothers and sisters are like, you can stay, Mom, but our brothers are American citizens. They need to come home. So long story short, the 2 youngest end up back. His dad, as soon as his dad turned 18, went and joined the Army. So you've got a family that was completely upended by our country based on what was occurring at the time, but yet still loved this country so much that they went and served this country. And then he ultimately served in the Marine Corps. And so it's those kind of stories that are unexpected that keep me going. The other thing is that, for instance, we talked about the airman that's out this week. When I get a text message from a guest who goes back and listens to their episode and thanks me and says, I've never told my story before. Thank you so much for letting me get it out there, because you've heard the episode. He's got older children that he's got a strained relationship with. He's improved himself and he's really working on being a better dad to his young daughter today. But he told me, he goes, maybe this little bit of them being able to hear my story might help my relationship with my older kids. And it's somebody who's not connected to me, who listens to a guest's episode and says, bro, I didn't know you were struggling. I'm struggling with the same shit. I'm going to go talk to somebody. It's that helping somebody through somebody else, so to speak. And so for me to say this, and I don't mean this lightly, it truly has become a passion project of mine. And it is something that I enjoy. I get fed off of sitting across the table from somebody and hearing their story, especially when they go down rabbit holes that maybe they were either nervous about going down or didn't think that they would be that open.
I couldn't agree more. The unexpected stories, but really getting thanked by a guest is, I don't think I have yet to really experience, there's very few things in my life that I've experienced so far that are that gratifying when someone goes, I never told anybody this. And it feels so good to have shared my transition experience. And it's just, no one asks. No one walks up to a cop, a firefighter, or a military member and goes, so what was it like moving on from that really involved part of your life? And everyone wants to talk about it, but no one wants to staple someone to a seat and be like, okay, you stay here for 2 hours. I've got some shit to unpack. And so I completely agree. What are some resources that you found through your time filming that you really want to refer people to, that you think are really beneficial, besides your podcast, of course?
Wow. I know that and man, you put me on the spot. There is a veterans group run by Marcus Capone, who's a former SEAL. And I want to say it's called VETS. Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, I think it is. But basically, he is coordinating trips down to Mexico for psychedelic retreats. There's stuff that even not necessarily from my podcast, but I interviewed a retired MARSOC gunny who created a nonprofit organization called Warfighter Made. And basically it's called adrenaline therapy. And he's created a company where he doesn't make off-road vehicles, but they modify off-road vehicles for veterans who have been injured, whether it be amputees, that type stuff. But equally, just veterans going through mental health issues, they strap them in a passenger seat. And like you said, he goes, nobody has PTS issues when you're flying across the desert at 80 miles an hour. There are people like Jose Gasca, who is also a former Marine. And I always try to avoid saying that because, man, talk to any Marine. They're never a former Marine.
Nope. Yep.
But
I am a Marine. My brother-in-law's one. I get it.
he was in the Marine Corps. Today, he is a police officer in LA, a jiu-jitsu guy. He created a nonprofit called Fighting Hold Jiu-Jitsu. And what he does is once a month, he basically rents out a given jiu-jitsu studio somewhere and opens it up to any first responder, any veteran. Just come on in. Even if you don't do jiu-jitsu, come on in, because we've talked about both sides of it. And I do believe that there is that sense of community that you do need to keep moving on. And if Earlier, I made it sound like you should not have that community of like-minded people. That is not what I'm saying. Just don't over rely on it. But what he does is, hey, come together, let's hang out on the mats. And it's free, doesn't cost you anything, but it's a way to be amongst like people. There are just so many of the guests that I've talked to who have started different nonprofit organizations just to be able to give back to the veteran or first responder community. The guest coming out next week is a retired Lieutenant Colonel, Marine Corps, who him and a couple buddies created the Veterans Beer Club. And it's meant to be a networking society for veterans. It is not, and they joke about it, but they're serious. It is not a drinking club. It just so happens that when they kicked it off, they're in San Diego. There's a garbage ton of breweries. Hey, let's just meet at this brewery. And then it just slowly started moving around. So for me, it's the resources that are out there. Take advantage of them. And whether you find it through my podcast, whether you find it through somebody else's podcast, whether you find it just searching the internet, watching TikTok, whatever, if you need it, take advantage of it. And there are a lot of first responders and veterans who are actively doing things to give back, to help.
The thing that gets people more now than anything is the paradox of choice when it comes to all the options, more than there being a lack of options. And that in and of itself is an interesting problem to tackle and talk about. But the last question that I want to ask you before we wrap is, what is your final piece of advice that you want to leave the listeners with?
Don't define yourself by your career. Be you first. Be the best husband, wife, brother, sister, father, mother, whatever it is. Be your career. Have fun in your career. These jobs are amazingly fun, and they give us the opportunity to do some really cool things. Take advantage of it. Most definitely take advantage of it. If you're going to give 20 or 30 years to an organization, get as much out of it as you can, but get the right things out of it. Get the things, whether it be training, whether it be a skill set, whether it be learning leadership, whether it be learning how to interact with people. One of the great things about being a cop is you have to be able to talk to people. You've got to be able to sit across the table and interview people. Use those skill sets to make yourself marketable. Don't just get wrapped up in what's fun right now and then be 10 or 15 years into it going, all right, so I was a 240 gunner. Now what? Because those skill sets, unless you're going to go do contracting work when you get out, really aren't needed on the civilian side. Whereas, like you mentioned, you were in the Air Force and they taught you how to address computer threats. That is a hugely marketable skill. And so leverage those things. Take advantage of the opportunities that you can get in these careers. Have fun doing them, but think about what you're going to do tomorrow and what you need to take from these organizations today.
I think that's a wonderful piece of advice to end on. Last thing, if people want to find you, where should they look?
The easiest place is the website, or the podcast website, transitiondrillpodcast.com. I'm on all social media. Instagram as me, Paul Pantani. Even though I have locked down Transition Drill, I don't use it. I work off Instagram as myself. You can get me on LinkedIn if you want to do a professional aspect, Paul Pantani. I'm on Twitter, but TikTok, it is actually Transition Drill Podcast clips, because I just mainly use it to push out advertisements to advertise the new episodes. But yeah, the website's the easiest because you can shoot me a message. If you want to get in contact with me, you can see old episodes. And then, and YouTube, Transition Drill Podcast.
Sweet. And I will make sure that all of those things are linked in the description below. So if you are interested in following Paul on all of his platforms or checking out the Transition Drill Podcast, I highly recommend that you go to those links and check it out. But Paul, thanks so much for coming on. It was a real pleasure to get to talk to you, to get to learn so much from your life experience, from your time interviewing guests. Again, I cannot state this enough to anyone who's out there. This dude's podcast is legit. It's definitely worth seeing. So I would highly encourage you to do. And thank you so much for making it to the end of the episode. If you liked what you saw here today, please subscribe. We always really appreciate it. And share with the people who need to hear it. And we will catch you on the next episode of the Post Military Podcast. Peace.